Chapter 1. Longbourn Village, Hertfordshire, England, December 1811. Miss Elizabeth Bennet hated seeing her elder sister in such low spirits. Jane's cheeks looked somewhat sunken. She lacked a healthy glow, and her bright, angelic eyes seemed to have dimmed. All for the cause of her lover, Mr. Charles Bingley. The gentleman had promised to return in a few days, but it was now a week later. Jane, who never complained about anything, said, "Were it simply a matter of his being late by a day or two, I would have no cause for concern. I should imagine the business which dictated his return to town has yet to be resolved. However, Miss Bingley's letter plainly stated her brother is to remain in town indefinitely, and I am beginning to believe her." Elizabeth sighed and put aside her book. "Dearest Jane, may I remind you again not to take Miss Bingley's letter to heart?" she said, although she too was beginning to have doubts. Not that she doubted for a second that Mr. Bingley was in love with her sister. However, Elizabeth would not dismiss the power of the gentleman's sisters and his closest friend, Mr. Darcy, over him. She could think of no other explanation for the remaining inhabitants of Netherfield to take their leave on Mr. Bingley's heels other than to persuade him to remain in town. Miss Bingley's letter to Jane had arrived within a day of Mr. Bingley's departure, thus casting an air of despair over Longbourn. Making matters worse, the news came shortly after Elizabeth had been the means of ruining her eager mother's scheme to secure the Bennet family's place at Longbourn in the event of her husband's demise. The morning after the Netherfield ball, Mrs. Bennet was confident she would rid herself of one of her 5 unmarried daughters. Determined that her eldest was soon to be married to their new neighbor, Mr. Bingley, the matchmaking mamma had pointed Mr. William Collins, the heir apparent to the Longbourn estate owing to an entailment, toward her second eldest daughter, but to the lady's surprise, Elizabeth had declared she would not have him, and owing to the manner of her refusal, which Mrs. Bennet had the misfortune of hearing through a closed door as she happened to place her ear against it, Mr. Collins abdicated his plan to choose a bride from among the Bennet daughters. Elizabeth recalled the part of her speech to Mr. Collins that had spared her from his design for future marital felicity involving her. "I should have paid more attention to the wisdom of Miss Lucas. She was quite right about your unwavering determination to marry for only the deepest and truest kind of love," Mr. Collins conceded. "There is a sensible young lady if I ever met one. She would never be foolish enough to jeopardize the security of her family and herself for such a fanciful notion," he added, sounding rather wise himself to Elizabeth's ears. With one arm folded over the other, Elizabeth had said, "If you truly believe what you are espousing, sir, then perhaps you ought to be standing before her, rather than wasting your time here with me." The shock on her mother's face when she nearly fell inside the room was such that Elizabeth would not soon forget. Nor was her mother's ensuing disapprobation something Elizabeth would quickly overcome. That her mother would think Elizabeth would commit to an alliance that would bring her nothing but misery was one thing, but that was nowhere near the worst part of Mrs. Bennet's lamentations. In front of Mr. Collins, Elizabeth's mother accused her of thinking too highly of herself, simply because the proud Mr. Darcy had singled her out for a dance at the Netherfield ball. She still felt the sting of her mother's words clawing at her sensibilities. Anyone who knew Elizabeth well knew how much she disliked the proud Mr. Darcy. It was not as though she had a choice in the matter. To have declined Mr. Darcy's request for a dance would have meant sitting out the rest of the ball. Elizabeth was not inclined to forego her share of the evening's gaieties. For her mother to suggest that Elizabeth forgot what she was about because of her dance with Mr. Darcy was vexing, for it meant her mother did not really know her at all. Considering the way Mrs. Bennet lamented Mr. Bingley's continued absence, she did not know her eldest daughter either. Surely, if her mother exercised more temperance, Jane would not be so ill at ease. Jane sighed. "I fear, following your advice not to take Miss Bingley's letter to heart, is easier said than done. I know how much you dislike her, but I have never seen her in an unfavorable light." Elizabeth could not argue with her sister on the latter score, for Jane was too good not to see the best in everyone. Jane always gives everyone the benefit of the doubt. Elizabeth did not falter. She only hoped Jane would never come to understand the less than agreeable side of humanity, for if she did, she would lose some of the light that made her so special. Far be it from me to be the one who poisons your mind against Miss Bingley. But I do not believe she acted in her brother's best interest. On the contrary, I believe she was thinking only of herself. Consider her assertion that her brother is amorous of Miss Georgiana Darcy, for instance, Elizabeth said, referring to the part of Miss Bingley's letter that Jane had said hurt her the most. Jane had purposely pointed out the part that read, "I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I do not know whether I ever mentioned to you my feelings on the subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunities now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connections as much as his own, and a sister's partiality is not misleading me, I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart. With all these circumstances to favor an attachment, and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event that will secure the happiness of so many?" And to think Jane had thought Miss Bingley had meant well. She could not have conceived that the woman's words were an open rebuke, intended to make her feel small. Instead, Jane had interpreted Miss Bingley's words as well intended and meant to spare her feelings. Elizabeth continued, "Did Mr. Bingley ever once show any sign of suffering or tender regard for the young lady? I dare say he never once mentioned her name. And what of the young lady's own brother? It is hard to suppose he would sit idly by and do nothing while the man destined for his sister was courting someone else. A man like Mr. Darcy would not have disregarded such conduct. In hindsight, can one really say that Mr. Bingley was courting me?" "I never saw a man more violently in love," said Elizabeth. "Indeed, no one who has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I am sure, cannot. She is not such a simpleton. She would have ordered her wedding clothes if she had seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself." One might suppose Mr. Bingley made a beginning, but who is to say his return to town did not remind him of what he is really about? Even you would argue I might have done more to encourage him. If not Miss Darcy, surely there are many other young ladies with whom he might spend his time. Young ladies who are far more receptive and encouraging than I was whenever we were together. I am sure your chance will come soon enough. Let us wait and see what happens before you give up all hope of Mr. Bingley's return." Jane sighed in resignation. "Very well, I will try. For now."